it's funny how things work out. It was probably 1992 or 1993 or so. I had almost got my master's degree, and I was, I really wanted to work in maritime museums. I really wanted to work in museums because I'd been working in museums sort of part-time and whatnot for years. And I really wanted to, get a job as a curator. And I was just sort of desperate one day, and I picked up the phone and I called the West Virginia State Historical Society. And just out of the blue, because I figured, I don't know, it's a random place. They've got an interesting history. They're not a big state. I'm just going to call them up and talk to the guy. So I talked to the director there, and he said, I told him, I wanted to be a museum curator. And he said, what are you expert in? I said, I'm not expert in anything. He said, become expert in something. It doesn't matter what you become expert in. Become expert in some aspect of material culture, and you will get a job in a museum. So I said, oh, that's pretty cool. All right. So, I'm going about my internships, and, I read Moby Dick. I read Moby Dick cover to cover. I loved reading Moby Dick. Moby Dick's a great book. And I go to, this internship at Mystic Seaport. I go to apply for the internship, and I talk to Glenn Gordonier, and I go through the interview, and he says, no, you're not suitable for the internship. All right. So, I go back to grad school and I study some more, and I reapply the next year, and I go and I talk to this lady, at Mystic Seaport, and she says, why do you want to be an intern? And I quoted Moby Dick. I said, because the sea connects all things. And she said, this interview's over. You show up on July 11th, and you can start your internship. So I was like, that was really cool. So, part of the thing is you go visit these maritime museums. So we went to the Kendall Whaling Museum and in Sharon, Stuart Franks, the director there. And I introduced myself to him, and then, nothing happened, went back to my life, as a landscape gardener back in Pennsylvania. And, by and by, I applied for an internship at the Kendall Whaling Museum, and I said, I don't know if you remember me or not. And Stuart's like, oh, of course I remember you. I was like, oh, great. He said, we'll meet, and we'll have an interview, at the train station in Philadelphia. So I go down to Philadelphia and I meet him and Mary. You guys know Stuart and Mary, I'm sure. So, we meet at the train station. And here, it's serendipity, it's really funny. He didn't remember me. He remembered another guy. He remembered another guy from Pennsylvania. That's all he knew, was that I was from Pennsylvania. And he remembered this other guy who really impressed him. And so here I get this internship, and lo and behold, I'm in the Kendall Whaling Museum, in the guts of the Kendall Whaling Museum for months and months and months. And all I did, day in and day out, was study whaling history, catalog logbooks and journals, look at scrimshaw, look at photographs, read books. I read everything twice. In the months that I was there. And, the whole time, this guy from the West Virginia Historical Society, become expert in something. And so I became an expert in, get this, illustrated American whaling narratives. So published books about whaling with pictures in them. Now, how's that for a specialty? Now, that was in 1993 or 4 or something. And so this book has been germinating that long. It really popped, unfortunately, it popped when Henry Kendall died, because the trustees of the Kendall Whaling Museum divested themselves of the institution, and it was gifted to the New Bedford Whaling Museum. So now, I go with the collection to the Whaling Museum. So now I've got the world's greatest collection of logbooks and journals and the world's second greatest collection of logbooks and journals together, and now they are, in fact, the world's greatest collection of logbooks and journals by several orders of magnitude. And we can begin to really pick things apart and draw lots and lots of connections. The book is about whaling art. So it's ideally about whaling art drawn by whalemen. engaged in the fishery. So I'm not interested in contemporary whaling art. I'm not interested in scrimshaw pictures that aren't pictures of whaling. There's a lot of that. There's a lot of scrimshaw out there, and it's got a lot of different topics. But I want pictures of killing whales, okay? Pictures of ships, pictures of the actual experience of whale hunting. Mostly because, in my various reading, it's just paying attention to the serendipity. It's paying attention to the details. And one of the details was Stuart C. Sherman, who was the librarian and curator of the Nicholson Whaling Collection at Brown University. Not at Brown University, I'm sorry, at the Providence Public Library. And he wrote this great book called The Voice of the Whaleman. And it was the first sort of catalog of whaling logbooks and journals. And he wrote this book in 1965. I was 1. But he writes, the whole subject of logbook illustration is one which deserves proper attention. Now, this is pretty good, right? I was 1. And then I was 50 when I actually, 50 years later, I came along and tackled this subject. It sat there waiting for somebody to come along. Kenneth R. Martin, PhD, director of the Kendall Whaling Museum, wrote another book called Whaleman's Paintings and Drawings, and it's quite a good book. And it was focused pretty much on the Kendall collection. But I tackled the subject differently from the way Ken tackled the subject. So I know you can't see it. I'm sorry about that. Don't you hate it when speakers do that? I apologize for the blurry photo. It's like, why didn't you get it right in the first place? So I will read them to you simply because I'm a good guy. Whaling, so the chapters are 7 and an epilogue. Whaling in America's larger maritime culture. This is very important. I'm going to talk about maritime culture, maritime culture, maritime culture. This whole talk is rooted in American maritime culture. Chapter 2 is Kept for My Own Amusement, a comparative interview of whalers' logbooks and journals. Chapter 3 is Recognizing Landfalls. And the reason that chapter 3 and chapter 4 is illustrating a whaling voyage around the world. And chapter 3 and chapter 4 were actually one huge chapter that was a presentation that I put together with an intern at the Kendall many years ago. And it was this, I just figured, I'll just cut it and paste it, right? So I cut this thing and I pasted it into the document. And it was like one chapter that was like 45,000 words or some ridiculous large thing, and my editor's looking at this. She's like, this is impossible. You can't do this. This is, so we broke it up into 2. And then the next one is one of my favorites, a gallery of ship portraits. Number 6 is the creative process. And this is pretty presumptuous, of me. To be writing in the 21st century and to be trying to delve into the creative process of the whaleman, because I can only do it from a scholarly point of view. I wasn't there. I can say this though. I keep an illustrated journal of every fishing season since 1997 that I started fly fishing in the salt water. So I keep a Dyer and I draw pictures in it. And as I was going through this book, I'm writing this book, I'm thinking, gee whiz, you do the same thing that those guys did. And so I had to think a little bit about why I drew pictures of the striped bass that I caught and where I caught them and what the weather was and stuff like that. So the creative process, number 7, is a gallery of whaling scenes, and then the epilogue, So Ends This Day, illustration in the waning years of Yankee whaling. One more bit about this book, and then we'll delve into the subject. As you may recall, in 2014, the Mystic Seaport and the Charles W. outfitted the Charles W. Morgan to sail on her 38th voyage. And one of the things that they did was they invited all kinds of people to apply to be 38th voyagers to sail on the voyage, right? Poets and historians and authors and musicians and photographers and all kinds of people. And you'd submit your proposal, and if they liked it, you would be invited to be a 38th voyager and sail on the Charles W. Morgan, the oldest commercial sailing ship in the world. Just happens to be a Yankee whaler built in New Bedford in 1841. This is a great thing. So I submitted my proposal, this grandiose thing, where I'm going to gain insights into whalemen's experience of illustrating their logbooks and journals on my voyage on the Charles W. Morgan. The 6 hours that I sail from Vineyard Haven to New Bedford, I'm going to gain this tremendous insight. And they said, sure, all right, Dyer, you can come on. You can be a 38th Voyager. So I was a 38th Voyager. And what happened was after my voyage, I'm paying attention on Facebook, and they start posting photographs of the Charles W. Morgan on Stellwagen Bank off of Provincetown. And what happened there was they ran into humpback whales, and they lowered their boats, and they rowed, Mystic Seaport, 6 people in a boat. They pulled up onto these whales, and their photographers are taking pictures. And they're taking pictures of this, and they're taking pictures, and they're posting them on Facebook. And I look at these pictures, and I'm like, wait a minute. I've seen this before. That looks exactly like a logbook illustration. That looks exactly like a logbook illustration. And that one, and that one, and that one. And so what happened was, that's the end of the story. And we'll get to those photos, but I think it's a very important thing to talk about that, because as it turns out, the art is way better than we think it is. And whalemen knew what they were doing. How do I know? You look at the photo of the whale and the whaleboat and the ship, and you look, it was done in 2014, and you look at the drawing that was drawn in a logbook in 1835, and they're the same. They are the same. And almost the same, but look, it's very much the same. Put it that way. So, what is a logbook? What is a journal? Logbooks are official documents, generally kept by the first mate. They record information. They are legal documents. So, they record information like latitude, longitude, the weather, the set of the sails, the course of the ship, and anything that happens during the day, in brief. And then what is a journal? A journal is a private diary, and it can be kept by anybody, and they can say anything they want to. In the heyday, in the great days of Yankee whaling, I'm going to say, for the purposes of my hypothesis, circa about 1790 till probably about the middle of the 1870s, these journals were kept by people with career ambitions to be a mariner, professional whaleman. And they drew things in there, and they drew them in their journals on purpose, to be used as reference to build their career. And there's plenty of examples of this. Logbooks are seldom illustrated in any meaningful way. They very often have whale stamps in them or nothing at all. So I'll get into whale stamps in a little bit. Whale stamps are very interesting and actually potentially important for understanding the success of the American whale fishery. So what scrimshaw? I mean, why was I even talking about scrimshaw? Well, there's a lot of different kinds of scrimshaw, and all of it represents this maritime culture, what it means to live in a community that's devoted to this particular industry, like Nantucket, from 1690 until 1870 or so, right? Did I get the last date more or less right? I think the last voyage was 1856 or 68. Okay, so it was an entire culture where entire families are involved in this industry. Same thing with the Cape. Same thing with Fairhaven, where I'm living, where my wife and I live at the moment. New Bedford. The whole, much of New England was a maritime culture. Much of American culture before the Civil War was rooted in maritime commerce. From Portland, Maine to New Orleans, we were tied together. So this stuff is very interesting stuff, you know, gifts from the whaling master to his wife back home, or to his mother, or to his sister. The same thing, you know, these things, these pie crimpers were made in the forecastle, you know, by the dozens. They were just, there's a lot of them. If you want to collect pie crimpers, you can collect pie crimpers till the cows come home. There are hundreds of them out there, and they're all interesting. There are a lot of fakes, so watch out for that. But there's a lot of real stuff too, and it's really quite amazing to look at what they represent. You know, to hold this thing in your hand and think about what it is. It was made on shipboard. It was made deliberately to give to someone back home. Busks. Whoops, sorry. Busks. You can't get more hardcore than a busk as far as this culture is concerned. And I'll explain what I mean by that in a second. Ditty boxes, you know, and other things. There's a lot of different things. And of course, the ultimate, you know, the engraved sperm whale tooth. Not etched. So don't go wandering around saying, do you have any etched sperm whale teeth? Because the person behind the counter will have you pegged as an amateur, and they'll sell it to you for 10 times as much as what you should be buying it for. They're engraved, right? Yes. Okay, so this is the hypothesis here, is that the mediums inform each other. But what do they mean? What do they mean? Are they all created equal? I mean, what am I talking about a maritime culture? You know, these busks. A busk is a piece of bone that's engraved with a picture of whaling on it, right? And a busk, it goes down the front of a woman's bodice, a corset. It was a really sort of a personal present. And what better definition of a maritime culture than a guy engaged in killing a whale, cuts up the bone, engraves a picture of the killing of the whale, brings it back and gives it to his girlfriend to put in her underwear. This is a culture. This is serious business, and this is this is what we see here. So there's that, but then there's the content, and are they all created equal? So this wonderful sperm whaling scene here, drawn by Joseph Washington Tuk of Provincetown, has no context. It's like the frontispiece to an abstract journal that he kept. He went on many whaling voyages. He kept abstract journals. He would draw every single whaling scene, whether the whales got away or whether they captured them, whether people died or whether they didn't. No matter what, he drew a picture of it. And this was the frontispiece. So there's no actual text that goes with this picture, but it was drawn by this Provincetown whaleman, and it's absolutely a fantastic thing. Great big sperm whale. I'm learning from my experience that whalemen rarely exaggerated. There was little point in exaggerating. If you kill a 100-barrel sperm whale, it's a 100-barrel sperm whale. You kill a 10-barrel sperm whale, it's a 10-barrel whale, and they draw pictures, little whales and big whales. And you can tell by the size of the whaleboat in comparison to the whale itself just how big that whale is. And so was Joseph Washington Tuk, did he actually see a whale that big? Well, I don't know. There's no particular context to this picture, so I'm going to say I don't know. I do know that maybe, just maybe, this whale escaped, because it's a dead giveaway when you're looking at whaling illustrations that a whale with a bloody spout is a dead animal. So that generally signifies an animal that was captured or died and was retrieved later. Clear spouts don't always generally indicate a whale that got away, actually. And then you come to George Edgar Mills. So George Edgar Mills draws these two pictures. He calls it Whaling Illustrated. He gives us a date. He gives us a latitude and longitude. And as it happens, we have logbooks and journals from these voyages. George Edgar Mills made it up. It was wishful thinking on his part. He wanted whales to be caught on that day, so he drew a picture. But there were no whales caught on that day, on either of those days. But, the interesting thing about the picture is if you look at it carefully, you've got a black guy pulling the oar. You've got two different irons, a single flute iron like that one right there, and a double flute iron like the one over on the wall. But up here, he's got two grommet irons. So they're a different kind of a harpoon, and it's very carefully drawn in there. But the event didn't happen. Now, that's an interesting analysis of these kinds of things, where you would sort of simply look at it and say, "Oh yeah, that's a busk and it's a whaling scene." But when you think a little bit more about it, Daniel Ricketson pretty much nailed it. He calls us a maritime people like ourselves, and that's you, and that's New Bedford, and that's Fairhaven, and that's New England for the most part. Coastal New England, at least. So scrimshaw precursors, some of these are pretty fabulous things. This is a maple wood busk, and it dates from 61. And this fella, his name is Wilcox, and he gave it to Sarah Smith the year they were married, 1761. But what thrills me about this piece is that it's got this fantastic topsail sloop. Extremely unusual to see an American colonial vessel, especially in that kind of detail. And this is 100 years before some of the great era of illustrating logbooks and journals. Maybe not 100 years, 80 years. So there's a tradition here. There's an untold story here that needs more exploration. This 18th century. These 18th century busks, many of them are beautifully illustrated. They're not made out of whalebone. They have nothing to do. They're not scrimshaw. They're something else. This just happens to be another view of a full-rigged colonial ship, with the big high stern. Let's go back for a second. This high poop deck, sort of full round, very large sails. One of the key things to look for in Whaleman's illustrations are they draw the panels in the sails. They always draw the panels in the sails. Whaleman's this is a sort of a important feature to sailors' art, is that they knew exactly what they were doing, and they include kinds of things in them automatically. They probably didn't even think about it. So this is Stephen Cahoon here. He drew this picture of the Polly, which was a whaling vessel in Walfish Bay in West Africa in the 1790s. And again, it still has this big high stern, sort of fat round bow to it. They're distinctive looking. When you imagine next time you read Moby Dick, I know you all are going to run right out and go right home onto your bedstand and pull your copy off your bedstand, because I'm sure that all of you have on your bedstand your copy of Moby Dick. No? At any rate, the Pequod was described as a claw-footed craft of Nantucket. A claw-footed craft. Claw-footed, what does that mean? It's Chippendale. It's Chippendale. The Chippendale style is claw-footed. It's a mid to late 18th century style. And that's what he's talking about. This is, if you imagine what the Pequod looked like, there's the Pequod. And there's another one. Except this is getting into now I'm moving into a different part of the discussion. I was very, very pleased to see right over here on the wall that picture of the Washington, that ship Washington, that was painted by a guy who ran a navigation school here. Navigation teachers and people who went to navigation school learned how to draw as part of their training, and that's an extremely important part of this whole story, is that you go to navigation school, you learn how to navigate, you become a master mariner. And in part of the classes, you learn calligraphy, you learn higher mathematics, and you're taught how to draw sea art professionally. And that's important. And I'll show you in a little bit why it's important. But Seth Barlow of Rochester, who's one of my favorite, artists of all time. He's not a whaleman. This isn't whaling. This is a merchant voyage from like Mattapoisett to Norway in the early part of the 18th century. But he drew these fabulous ships, and I mean stylized. Look at this. That's not what the stern of the ship looked like. He just sort of drew it that way. But every single line and every block is exactly where it's supposed to be. And then he drew this thing that he calls a whale. But your guess is as good as mine what it actually is. But similarly, this ship was built in New Bedford in 1812 to the order of Seth and Charles Russell, who were whaling merchants. But this is not a whaling vessel. This is a merchant vessel. But the reason that I include it here is because it's sailor's art. So the great era of ship portraiture wouldn't come around until the late 1830s and into the 1840s and 50s. That's the great era of American ship portraiture. There were people painting ship portraits earlier, but it didn't become the great tradition. What you see more often are people portraits with ships in the background. That's through the 1790s right up to the middle of the 1830s and later into the 1840s. But ship portraiture itself came along a little bit later. But sailors drew their ships very, very often. And they looked like this. They're watercolors. They are very precise. They're stiff. James called it naive. And it might be naive. But they're stiff. They're not. This is not William Bradford or Clement Drew we're talking about. This is some guy who draws a picture of a ship, and it's a nice painting, beautiful painting. But is it art? I suppose it is. And then I don't know why I included Benjamin Russell fits into this maritime culture is very, very important. I mean, he was the son of Seth Russell Jr., who owned the Catherine. His forebear actually settled Bedford Village back in the colonial era. Joseph Russell. He was a up and coming merchant in New Bedford. And when the Jackson administration came in and the Andrew Jackson administration came to power, and Andrew Jackson tried to consolidate the American banking system, all the bankers got very nervous and they called in all of their debts, and the Russell family went bust. Charles, Seth Jr., and their son Benjamin. So Benjamin was on the board of directors of the Marine Bank, and he was out of a job. He had nothing. He bummed around throughout the 1830s, and then he finally goes to sea as a boat steerer on a ship out of New Bedford in 1841. The same year that Melville goes to sea, the same year that Charles W. Morgan was built, the same year the Lagoda entered the whale fishery in New Bedford. 1841 was a big year. Benjamin Russell sails out, and he keeps his sketchbook as he goes. And when he came back, he conceived the notion sometime that he was going to do this panorama. He was going to paint a panorama because panoramas were a very popular form of entertainment, and he was going to make some money this way. So he paints this painting. It's 8.5 feet high and 1,275 feet long, and him and Caleb Purrington paint this thing, and they take it on the road. But the reason that I'm talking about it now is that it encompasses, this is the maritime culture that I'm talking about. This ship, this is the William Hamilton, right, owned by Isaac Howland. Isaac Howland Jr. of New Bedford, one of the largest whaling merchants in the city at the time. And who's William Hamilton? Well, William Hamilton was supposedly the first white man to harpoon a whale on Cape Cod in the 1640s, 1630s or 1640s. Whether the story is true or not, I don't know. But that's who he was. And Isaac Howland, along about 1840 or so, decides that he's going to have Jethro and Zechariah Hillman build him a ship, and he's going to call it the William Hamilton. Now, there's more to this culture than meets the eye. This is interesting stuff. He's hearkening back already 200 years. He's hearkening back to this history. And that's what he names his whale ship. And that's what Benjamin Russell paints, anchored in the stream of the Acushnet River. And so I'll run through these, Matthews and Mashow, John Mashow was that black kid from Virginia who some Dartmouth guy recognized had talent and brought him back up to Peyton Aram and stuck him in a shipyard, and by and by he was such a highly skilled shipwright that he owned the yard, and he built many famous whalers. So that's the John Mashow, and then here's Paul Cuffey, the son of a freed slave. He married a Wampanoag woman from Cuttyhunk, and he himself built ships. And in the middle of the war of the Revolution, the American Revolution, he's coming here. He's coming to Nantucket and Martha's Vineyard, and he's bringing supplies out here, right, in the middle of the war. He's an entrepreneur. He makes something of himself. He's a great American. No two ways about it. And then along the lines of, here's one of these portraits I was talking about, This is Captain Thomas Nye, about 1795 or so, with one of those ships in the background with the high stern and the full bow. And what do you see? Well, all of his navigating equipment is right there. And then what about these guys? George Howland and his sons, George Howland Sr. And George Howland Sr., he doesn't have any navigating instruments. What does he have? It's like Woody Guthrie said, some will rob you with a 6-gun and some with a fountain pen. Well, that's what George Howland has in his hand, is a fountain pen. That's the business of the merchant. He's got accounting books and he's adding up numbers. He's a businessman, and his sons are right at his shoulder, and there's a ship in the background flying his house flag. So he's at the top of the heap. William Bradford, painting, this fabulous marine painting, middle of the 1850s, and this very, very, very rare drawing of launching of a ship in Fairhaven. For all the ships that were built in New Bedford and Fairhaven, there's only one original drawing and one print. That's it. So we don't know really hardly anything at all about what shipbuilding in the region actually looked like, except for that picture. This is one of my favorite. I love this. This is fantastic. I call it the pathetic origins of the Illustrated American Whaling Journal, because Peter Pease, whenever he encounters a parmacety, what he calls a parmacety, which is a spermaceti whale, he draws a little fish. It's not a whale. He draws a fish because they call them fish. They know they're whales. They know they're not fish, but he draws it as a fish. Isn't that priceless? That is absolutely priceless. This is the greatest thing ever. I was so happy to discover the little fish that Peter Pease drew in his whaling journal, in his whaling logbook, I mean. It's just great. And so here's, one of these navigation exercise books, and this is what I'm talking about. These ships are very precisely drawn, and they were trained that way. So navigators were trained to be able to chart where they were and illustrate their journals in a useful fashion, useful to commercial navigation. What do I mean by that? Well, here's couple of really good examples. Reuben Jones of Newburyport, in 1803, he's on the coast of Chile in 1803. Now, Lewis and Clark hadn't crossed North America in 1803. We didn't even know where the Missouri River rose in 1803, but we got some guy from Newburyport is hunting seals on the coast of Chile. How did they do that? Well, one of the ways that they did that was by being expert navigators and expert shipbuilders coming out of a maritime culture. This is the evidence for that. Much, much later, George Bailey draws this view of the harbor of St. Francisco. So, there is no San Francisco at this point. All there is the Yerba Bueno mission. That's all there is cows and Catholic priests in California. That's all there is. They hadn't discovered gold yet. So this guy, he sails in, charts it, sails back out again, and that's it. They explored the place, and he drew it in his journal. So, one step up from Peter Pease is Edmund Gardner, and this is one of the earlier. It's not the earliest. There is one very, very early drawing of a sperm whale in a whaleman's journal, and it's at the Mass Historical Society, and it was drawn by Robert Treat Payne on board the sloop Seaflower of, I can't remember the port, but it was a sperm whaling voyage to the North Atlantic. It was gone for like 3 months, and he came back, but he drew this really nice picture of a sperm whale, and it's in the Mass Historical Society. I don't know why I didn't include it in here. I think it's in a footnote. I probably should have included it. I feel bad now. I'll hang my head. But Edmund Gardner drew, these whales in the margins, and this moves us toward this discussion of whale stamps. But the marginal illustrations are really pretty important because they begin to allow the industry to grow. And what I mean by that is whaling merchants will begin to accrue piles of these logbooks, and the sailors themselves will begin to accrue piles of journals. There's nothing accidental about a Nantucket merchant sending a voyage to the Brazil banks or a voyage to the coast of Guinea. He knew when and where and why to send his masters to these places. And part of the reason that they knew that and that they could accrue that knowledge is this adaptation of adding illustrations to the journals, and also whale stamps. So here's the stamps. Why this is significant is when you come back from the voyage, if you own 2 or 3 ships, an owner can go through very, very rapidly and begin to accumulate information about where whales were seen and taken, what species, how large they were. Write it out in instructions, give it to the master, or write a letter of instruction saying, spend time on the coast of Zanzibar between April and July before heading to the coast of Australia for right whales, before heading back, to fill up with right whale oil in the South Atlantic before heading home. That's sort of a weird thing. So whale stamps are actually quite significant things. They're not just simply decoration. They had a useful purpose, and I believe that useful purpose was building the effectiveness of the whale fishery. This is just kind of interesting. These letterpress journals, you could buy them. So you could go to navigation stores and buy letterpress sea journals, and lo and behold, that vignette of the ship, some people believe it's the Constitution, USS Constitution. I don't know if it is. Maybe it is. In any event, it's a full rig sailing ship. It begins to turn up on scrimshaw. So and in this particular case, it was adapted to a whaling scene. It's not a whaler, it's just a ship. But it was evidently a well-loved thing because it turns up fairly frequently. All right, so this is the exciting bit. Believe it or not, this is the exciting bit. Journal kept by Joseph Tabor on board the ship Rodman of New Bedford, Robert M. Joy, Master, 1828 to 1830. Isn't it lovely? It's a great thing. And it must be true because Mike Dyer writes about it and puts it in his book, figure 200, there it is, big as life. 3 days ago, a couple came into the museum. They had a journal with them. They brought it in, they set it down. I opened it up, and it was identical in every way to this Ship Rodman of New Bedford journal. Identical. Except there was a different voyage. It was a later voyage. It was ship Roman, 1835 to 39 on a sperm whaling voyage to the North Pacific. So I'm like, oh, okay, well, this is cool. What must have happened is that, on the flyleaf it says, somebody had written in ink, to Edward C. Jones, 1840. Edward Coffin Jones was a major merchant. He was an investor in the Roman voyage, and so my first surmise was, oh, okay, well, Joseph Tabor created a fair copy of this journal kept by the master and gave it to Edward Coffin Jones for his reference. But I went back through, I laid them out on my desk, laid them side by side, went through page by page, page by page, page by page. That's not what happened. That's not what happened. Joseph Tabor bought a journal at Abraham Shearman's navigation store, and he writes on the flyleaf, Joseph Tabor's book, bought at Abraham Shearman's, December 1827. The Rodman voyage wouldn't leave until June of 1828. So there's this big gap between the time he buys the book and the time the voyage leaves. The Roman journal bears Robert M. Joy's signature with a flourish under it at the end of the voyage in the same hand. So there's no doubt about it that Joseph Tabor did not make these drawings. Robert M. Joy did. And this is what's so slippery about history. This is why you can't be an authority. I'm not an authority of anything. I'm only an authority until these people walk through with something that proves me wrong. And then I'm not an authority anymore. You know what I'm saying? So, this stuff is so slippery. Every time you think you know something, maybe you do, maybe you don't. What we do know is that this is the ship Susan of Nantucket, because it's called the ship Susan of Nantucket, and it's the only contemporaneous view of the ship Susan of Nantucket not on a sperm whale tooth. So Frederick Myrick drew engraved these 37 sperm whale teeth, engraved, ship Susan on the coast of Peru, ship Barclay on the Japan grounds, death to the living, long live the killers, success to sailors' wives, and greasy luck to whalers. What a great thing. I believe that you don't even need to know anything else. If you understand one Frederick Myrick sperm whale tooth, you need all that there is to know about Yankee whaling. You've got patriotic motifs. You've got the eagle. You have the anchor of hope. You have a beautifully drawn, full-rigged ship sailing out of Nantucket, hunting sperm whales on the coast of Japan in 1829. You've got, this death to the living, long live the killers, success to sailors' wives, and greasy luck to whalers. He's not apologizing for anything. He's telling you the way it is. This is how they're earning their living. My poor wife is back home somewhere. Maybe I'll come back and maybe I won't, but I wish her well. and I hope that I'm going to make my living. So, the Myrick, the Susan's Teeth are absolutely stunning pieces, and I have at least one of them in the book. Whoops. These are great. This is a wonderful couple. The ship South Carolina was a right whaler, right whaling in the Southern Ocean, in the Southern Indian Ocean. And what's really, really interesting about this is that this fellow Joseph Lee and William W. Taylor each drew their own version of the voyage. And this is William W. Taylor's right whaling picture. It's a fantastic right whaling picture. Double spouts, they're cutting in a right whale. You got the guy on the lookout, You can always tell an early whaling voyage because the guy's on the lookout. You see one arm sticking out like this because they don't have masthead hoops. They're not standing in the hoops because there aren't any hoops. Later pictures, like the one on the back of the book, where you see the guys are standing like this. Those guys are standing in masthead hoops, and those are later pictures. The earlier pictures don't have that. But what's really funny is that this Joseph Lee of Philadelphia, he chooses to draw the ship South Carolina sperm whaling, like that's what they were doing. They weren't sperm whaling. They caught one sperm whale. But Joseph Lee, if he has to memorialize his experience, it's flags flying. Look at that flag flying proudly, banners flying, and they're going hunting sperm whales because he's not some nasty old right whaler. He's a sperm whaler. And they got one, and there it is, the one with the bloody spout, and that's it. So I think it made 40 barrels. so he memorializes his 40-barrel sperm whale in no uncertain terms. Oliver Wilcox, he's a really interesting character. But he must have been quite a popular guy because he illustrated other people's journals in addition to his own. At least two of his shipmates have illustrations in their journals that he drew. Oliver Wilcox drew in addition to his own. And so it was a little bit confusing to sort of sort through all these voyages of the Canton and figure out which one was which. But in the end, I believe I've got there in the end. These cutting-in pictures are pretty cool. This one actually has the harpoon is still in the blubber. The laundry is in the rigging. They're just really nice cutting-in pictures. Benjamin Beaudry, he never illustrated anything. He was the first mate on the voyage, and he didn't illustrate anything except this horrific event right in the same latitude and longitude where the Essex was rammed and sank on the offshore ground. Benjamin Beaudry ran into this ugly sperm whale, which went to work old-fashioned and busted his boat all to pieces. So he was actually one of the guys in the water. He wasn't the guy lancing the whale. He was one of the guys in the boat that got all smashed up. So that was the one and only picture in his journal. So this was an event that moved him tremendously to the point where he had to draw it. Same thing with Ephraim Harding. Get this, Ephraim Harding and the Arab of Fairhaven sailed from Fairhaven the whole way down the Atlantic Ocean, the whole way across the South Atlantic, around the Cape of Good Hope, across the Indian Ocean, and into the Gulf of Aden without ever once seeing a whale the whole time. When they get to the Gulf of Aden, they killed 14 whales in one day. Harding was impressed. He was impressed with this. He drew this. He's not the greatest artist in the world, but he was mightily impressed with that day's work, and so he drew this scene, of all these small sperm whales. You got a stove boat here with a flag flying. The boat's very low in the water. You got guys in the water. You got this guy on the lookout here with his wigwag. He's pointing the boats to where the whales are, giving them directions. And so it's just this fantastic sperm whaling picture, and there's a lot to really to learn from it and from the impetus of the guy who created it. So here's one of Joseph Washington Tuk's abstracts. So this is an abstract of event, where they go on to a couple of small sperm whales, and they didn't get either of them. Here they go on to a 50-barrel whale with 3 boats, and they kill it. And then he keeps a chart of the western grounds there to the west of the Azores, where the ships of the Provincetown fleet were taking whales. It's not all his. They're not all his ship. There are a number of ships from the Provincetown fleet, and this is where they're taking whales. Joseph Washington Tuk was a serious whaleman. He had aspirations. He did his homework. I'm not going to go into that story. This is an interesting story. Perry G. Wing of Westport, Massachusetts has got to be the most boring person I have ever encountered. He had absolutely nothing, not a whiff of imagination in this guy's 4 journals that we hold. But on one of them, this fellow William Schlinkoff was on the voyage with him, and he drew this fabulous sperm whaling picture. And he drew other pictures in Perry G. Wing's journal. And it's just, just so rich with interest. The picture even matches the entry in the journal. I mean, it's this really great stuff, but Perry Wing didn't have anything to do with it. He didn't draw it. And for many, many years, it was attributed to Perry Wing until, some sort of forensic research on my part turned up the fact that it was this William Schlinkoff guy that drew this. All right, so you're probably familiar with this. You may have seen this if you have a Time Life copy of the Whalers. This journal has appeared in publication after publication after publication as the quintessential whaling journal. The journal itself is actually an authentic whaling journal of the 1830s. Everything in color and all of the whaling scenes are fakes. They were drawn in sometime after about 1890, after a certain magazine article came out, and some enthusiast, whaling enthusiast who happened to like whaling a lot, had their whaling journal, and he just drew pictures in it. It is not what it purports to be. And this was one of the great, this is one of the, really great moments. It's funny, these little moments that come up. I had a volunteer, and she's not just a volunteer, she contributed a great deal to this book. Her name is Jan Keeler. And I had Jan and another fella go through the old Dartmouth collection and just pull out anything that was illustrated. Pull it all out so I could take a look at it. And she came into my office one day and she said, "I found an illustrated journal." "What is it?" And this is a mistake, by the way. It's not the Lottie Beard, it's the Lottie B. Cook. She said, "It's this Lottie B. Cook journal." And I looked at it and I was like, "Jan, don't you recognize that? We've seen this before. We know what this is." I said, grab that the William Baker of Warren journal, and we laid them out side by side. And the Lottie B. Cook journal was done 1885 to 87, and this William Baker of Warren journal was 1838 to 39. And there's not a chance that they were done by the same person. They were done later by somebody who just felt like doing it. And I find that absolutely fascinating. And of course, it's important to point out that it's not an authentic, it's not what it purports to be. But more important than that is this sort of late 19th, early 20th century beginning to form a sense of romance of things past. Whaling's going away. Times are changing. Clifford Ashley tells you, if you haven't read the last chapter of The Yankee Whaler lately, you should read it. It's absolutely spot on, beautiful observations on the part of Clifford Ashley of the changing American culture and how it can be glimpsed. And he talks about, 1 in 50 logbooks escape the rubbish heap. Betsy can tell you that these these things come in, these logbooks and journals, they come in, and little kids, have scrawled in them with crayons, or somebody has made a scrapbook out of it. It just happened. They weren't that important or that valuable after they were done, because it was just life. It's not this incredibly important thing that we today cherish these things because there's so much to learn from them. People at the time, maybe it was important, maybe it wasn't. You put a scrapbook in there, you let your kid play with it, and they color it in with coloring books. And somebody who was really interested in whaling liked to draw whaling pictures, and that's what he did in these two journals. And so here's the final slide of the evening, is what I was talking about the Mystic Sea, about the Charles W. Morgan and this whaling illustration from the 1850s. And this was what really just sort of really blew me away when I saw this photograph. I said, I've seen that before. I've seen that very picture before. And there they are. So these illustrations matter. I think you can learn a lot from them. I think that they are very accurate. The people who drew them were trained. They had something that they wanted to say, not publicly. They were saying it to themselves. These are not public documents. This isn't like scrimshaw that they give to somebody. This is something that these people kept for their own interest. Maybe they would give it to somebody when they got back home to say, look at my cool thing. But very often they were kept for their own private purposes. So, thank you all very much. I'll be happy to entertain any questions you may have. Yes? Lydia Tuk. Of course, Susan Austin Veeder is in the book. Lydia Tuk's journal was really quite interesting because she drew a right whale in the North Atlantic. And as far as I know, it is the only picture of a North Atlantic right whale that anybody ever drew. They were all but eliminated by that time. Lydia Tuk of Provincetown. And I think that's it. I think it was just Susan and Lydia. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you all very much.